The digital clock on Marissa's phone reads 2:47 a.m., its harsh blue glow illuminating the chaos scattered across her living room floor. Cardboard boxes torn open like wounds, their contents spilling across the worn carpet in a desperate tableau of broken dreams and mounting desperation. Her hands shake as she holds up a cracked phone case, its plastic shell split down the middle like her hope. This is what $200 bought her. This is what stands between her family and homelessness. 46 hours. That's all the time left before Mr. Devlin changes the locks on the apartment she's called home for 3 years. The eviction notice sits on her kitchen counter like a death sentence, its bold red letters spelling out the brutal mathematics of her failure. Late rent, accumulating fees, and now this gamble that seems to mock her desperation with every worthless item she pulls from the pallet. Her 8-year-old daughter Emma sleeps peacefully in the next room, unaware that her mother is sorting through garbage in the middle of the night, praying for a miracle that might not come. 6-year-old Tyler's asthma inhaler sits on the coffee table, a reminder of the prescriptions she couldn't afford to fill last month, the doctor visits she had to skip, the choices no parent should have to make. Marissa's fingers work methodically through the debris of her desperate purchase. Expired makeup palettes with cracked mirrors, a Bluetooth speaker that won't turn on, children's toys with missing pieces. Each item feels like another nail in the coffin of her hopes, another dollar she'll never see again. The shipping costs alone ate into money she didn't have, charged to a credit card that's already maxed out, and screaming warnings about overdraft fees. She remembers the confidence she felt just 24 hours ago, watching YouTube videos about liquidation pallet flips, convinced she could turn her last $200 into enough money to save her home. The success stories made it look so easy, so profitable, so possible. But those videos never showed this moment, never captured the crushing weight of reality when the fantasy collides with desperation. The apartment feels smaller in the darkness, closing in around her like the walls of her financial trap. 3 jobs weren't enough. The side hustle selling crafts on Etsy barely covered groceries. The emergency room visit when Tyler's asthma flared up last month wiped out what little savings she had managed to scrape together. Now here she sits, surrounded by junk, with the clock ticking toward a future she can't bear to imagine. But Marissa Hale has never been one to give up easily. Even now, even with the weight of failure pressing down on her shoulders, she continues sorting through the pallet's contents. Because somewhere in this mess, there has to be something. There has to be a reason she felt compelled to make this desperate gamble. There has to be hope, even if she can't see it yet through the tears blurring her vision. 3 months earlier, Marissa Hale believed she had figured out the formula for survival. Wake up at 5 a.m., get the kids ready for school, drop them off, and rush to her first job at the medical billing office where she spent 8 hours processing insurance claims for $12 an hour. The afternoon shift at the grocery store paid $10.50, but it meant she could pick up Emma and Tyler afterward and still make it home by dinner time. Weekends belonged to her side hustle, crafting personalized jewelry and baby blankets that she sold through social media, hoping each small sale would add up to something meaningful. It wasn't the life she had planned when she graduated from community college with her associate's degree in business administration. Back then, she had dreams that stretched beyond paycheck-to-paycheck living, beyond calculating whether she could afford both groceries and gas in the same week. But life has a way of rewriting your story when you're not looking. Her ex-husband Mark had promised to help with child support, but promises don't pay rent, and his contributions became as reliable as his presence in their children's lives. The apartment on Maple Street wasn't much, but it was theirs. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen where Emma loved to help make pancakes on Sunday mornings. Tyler had claimed the corner by the living room window as his reading spot, where he would curl up with his favorite books about dinosaurs and space exploration. Marissa had painted their bedrooms herself, staying up late after her shifts to create something beautiful for her children, something that felt like home rather than just a place to sleep. The first overdraft fee came in February, a $25 penalty that felt like a slap across her already strained budget. She had miscalculated by $3 when buying Tyler's school supplies, and that small error cascaded into a financial avalanche she couldn't climb out of. The bank seemed to delight in her mistakes, charging fees for fees, penalties for penalties, until her account became a black hole that consumed every dollar she managed to earn. Her side hustle on Etsy had started as a creative outlet, something she could do while the kids did homework, a way to feel productive and artistic in the margins of her exhausted life. The first sale, a custom bracelet for $18, felt like winning the lottery. She remembered dancing around the kitchen with Emma and Tyler, celebrating as if that single transaction would change everything. But the orders came sporadically, and after platform fees, materials, and shipping costs, her profit margins were thinner than tissue paper. By March, Marissa was working 3 jobs and still falling behind. The medical billing office cut her hours when the company downsized. The grocery store promised more shifts that never materialized. Her jewelry sales slowed as the novelty wore off and competition increased. She found herself checking her bank balance obsessively, calculating and recalculating the same impossible math, trying to make $400 stretch to cover $800 worth of bills. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Tyler's inhaler ran out and the pharmacy wanted $68 she didn't have. She watched her 6-year-old struggle to breathe while she called insurance companies, begged for payment plans, and finally borrowed money from her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had her own struggles, but somehow found room in her heart and budget to help a desperate mother. That night, after the kids were asleep, Marissa sat at her kitchen table surrounded by bills she couldn't pay, job applications she'd already submitted, and the growing weight of her inadequacy as a provider. She had done everything right, or at least everything she knew how to do. She worked harder than most people she knew, sacrificed more than anyone should have to sacrifice, and still found herself sliding toward a cliff she couldn't see the bottom of. The eviction notice arrived on a Thursday, delivered by a process server who looked at her with the kind of pity that burns worse than contempt. 60 days to pay 3 months of back rent plus fees or find somewhere else to live. 60 days to figure out how to keep her children's world from falling apart. 60 days to perform a miracle she didn't believe in, but desperately needed to happen. The YouTube video that changed everything had a thumbnail that seemed to glow with possibility. A young man, probably not much older than Marissa, standing in front of boxes and holding up a stack of cash with the kind of smile that promised easy money and second chances. The title read, "I made $3,000 from one liquidation pallet. You won't believe what I found." And despite her usual skepticism about get-rich-quick schemes, Marissa found herself clicking play at 11:30 p.m. on a Sunday night when sleep felt impossible and hope felt even more elusive. She watched with growing fascination as the creator explained the world of liquidation pallets, returned merchandise from major retailers sold in bulk lots for a fraction of their retail value. Department stores, electronics retailers, and online giants all had excess inventory they needed to move quickly. Customer returns, overstock, seasonal items, display models, all bundled together and sold to liquidation companies who then resold them to anyone willing to take a chance on mystery merchandise. The mathematics seemed almost too good to be true. Buy a pallet for $200 or $300, flip the individual items online, and potentially make thousands in profit. The video showed electronics worth hundreds of dollars, designer clothing with tags still attached, home goods that looked practically new. Even accounting for some damaged items, the potential return on investment looked like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in financial quicksand. Marissa spent the next 3 hours falling down a rabbit hole of pallet flipping content. Success story after success story, ordinary people transforming small investments into life-changing profits. A single mother in Ohio who paid off her car with one pallet flip. A college student who funded his entire semester with liquidation reselling. A retired couple who turned pallet flipping into a sustainable income stream that supplemented their Social Security. But it was the story of Maria, a woman whose situation seemed to mirror her own, that finally convinced her to take the leap. Maria had faced eviction, had children to feed, had tried everything else before discovering liquidation pallets. The video showed her sorting through her first purchase, the mix of anxiety and excitement on her face as she discovered valuable items hidden among the ordinary ones. 6 months later, Maria had her own apartment, her own car, and a thriving resale business that gave her family the stability they had never known. By 3 a.m., Marissa had found herself on liquidation websites, scrolling through available pallets with the kind of focused intensity she usually reserved for job hunting. Electronics pallets, home goods pallets, clothing pallets, each one promising its own brand of potential salvation. The prices ranged from $100 to $500, not including shipping costs that could add another $50 to $100 depending on location and weight. She settled on a mixed electronics and home goods pallet from a liquidation company in Georgia. The description was tantalizingly vague. Customer returns and overstock from major retailers. Condition varies. Manifest not available. Sold as is. The retail value was listed at over $2,000, though the fine print warned that actual resale value could be significantly lower. Still, for $195 plus $58 shipping, it seemed like the kind of calculated risk that could change everything. The decision to purchase came at 4:17 a.m., made with the kind of clarity that only desperation can provide. Marissa used her debit card, knowing it would overdraw her account, but hoping the pallet would arrive quickly enough for her to start selling items before the negative balance became unmanageable. The confirmation email felt like a contract with fate, a promise that she was finally taking control of her situation instead of just reacting to it. For the next 4 days, Marissa lived in a state of cautious optimism that felt foreign after months of relentless pessimism. She researched selling platforms, watched tutorials on photography and listing optimization, and even started planning how she would organize her inventory once it arrived. Emma and Tyler noticed the change in their mother's mood, the way she hummed while making breakfast and seemed more present during their evening homework sessions. She told herself stories about what might be in the pallet. Maybe there would be gaming systems or tablets that could sell for hundreds of dollars each. Maybe there would be brand name appliances or designer items with tags still attached. Maybe there would be just enough valuable merchandise to not only pay the rent, but also create a buffer against future emergencies, a foundation for the kind of financial stability that had always seemed just out of reach. The liquidation pallet represented more than just merchandise to flip. It represented agency in a situation where she had felt powerless, action in the face of paralysis, hope where there had been only fear. For the first time in months, Marissa felt like she was moving toward something instead of just running away from everything that threatened to destroy the life she had built for her children. The tracking number became her obsession, checked multiple times a day as the package made its way from Georgia to her apartment complex. Each update felt like a step closer to salvation, each delay like a test of her newfound faith in the possibility of change. The delivery truck pulled away from Marissa's apartment complex at 2:43 p.m. on a Tuesday, leaving behind a single wooden pallet wrapped in industrial plastic sheeting that looked nothing like the treasure chest of possibilities she had imagined. The reality of her purchase sat heavy and unglamorous on the sidewalk, requiring 2 trips and her neighbor's help to drag the bulky mass up 2 flights of stairs to her front door. Already, her back ached and her optimism began to waver as she realized the first harsh truth of liquidation pallets. What looks manageable online becomes a logistical nightmare in real life. The plastic wrap came off with the sound of tearing dreams. Inside, boxes stacked haphazardly revealed their contents like a cruel magic trick performed in reverse, making hope disappear instead of creating it. The first item Marissa pulled out was a Bluetooth speaker, its sleek black surface promising quality until she noticed the deep crack running along one side and the missing charging port cover. She pressed the power button with diminishing confidence, but the device remained stubbornly silent, as dead as her faith in online success stories. Box after box yielded similar disappointments. A hair straightener with a frayed cord that made her nervous to even touch. Children's toys missing essential pieces, rendering them useless puzzles that no parent would buy for their child. A tablet that powered on but displayed a spider web of cracks across its screen, making it virtually worthless in the resale market. Kitchen appliances that looked promising from a distance but revealed sticky residues and missing parts upon closer inspection. The makeup palettes she had hoped might appeal to beauty enthusiasts were expired, their once vibrant colors now separated and chalky. The designer-looking handbags turned out to be obvious knockoffs with crooked stitching and hardware that felt cheap between her fingers. Even the clothing, which she had counted on as reliable sellers, came in odd sizes and unusual cuts that would appeal to almost no one willing to pay shipping costs for online purchases. As afternoon turned to evening, Marissa found herself surrounded by what could only be described as expensive garbage. Items that might have once held value in their original context became worthless when filtered through the harsh reality of the secondary market. Every YouTube tutorial she had watched, every success story she had believed, seemed like elaborate fiction designed to separate desperate people from money they couldn't afford to lose. The mathematics of her situation began to crystallize with brutal clarity. Even if she could sell every single item in the pallet, the individual prices she could reasonably expect would barely cover the original purchase price, let alone generate the profit she desperately needed. An eBay listing for a broken Bluetooth speaker might net her $10 if she was lucky, but after eBay's selling fees, PayPal's processing charges, and the packaging materials needed to ship it safely, her actual profit would be maybe $3 or $4. The shipping cost calculations proved even more devastating. Most items were too bulky or too fragile to ship economically through standard postal services. A kitchen appliance that might sell for $25 would cost $12 to ship safely, eating into already thin margins. Smaller items could be combined to make shipping more efficient, but then she risked damage during transit, which would lead to returns, negative feedback, and the complete loss of both the item and the shipping costs. Marissa spent hours photographing items, trying to find angles that minimized obvious defects while still representing them honestly enough to avoid disputes with buyers. The camera on her phone, already old and struggling with battery life, seemed to highlight every flaw, every scratch, every sign of wear that would make potential customers scroll past her listings without a second thought. She found herself becoming an expert in creative description writing, searching for diplomatic ways to say damaged and used that might still attract bargain hunters. By midnight, she had managed to create 17 eBay listings, each one a small exercise in optimism over evidence. She priced items competitively, knowing that desperation made her willing to accept profits that wouldn't even cover her time investment. A hairdryer with a loose handle was listed for $15, hoping someone would overlook the obvious safety concerns. A decorative picture frame with a chip in the corner went up for $8, marketed as having vintage character rather than damage. The first day passed without a single sale. Then the second day. By the third day, Marissa realized that even her pessimistic projections had been too optimistic. The liquidation market was flooded with similar items from other desperate sellers, all competing in a race to the bottom that benefited no one except the platforms collecting fees from each transaction. Her phone buzzed constantly with lowball offers that would leave her losing money on every sale. $7 for the Bluetooth speaker she had listed at $15. $3 for kitchen items she had hoped might bring $10. The offers came from buyers who understood the desperation driving most liquidation sellers, people who made their living by exploiting the financial pressure that forced quick sales at any price. The eviction notice still sat on her kitchen counter, its deadline approaching with mathematical precision, while her pile of unsold inventory grew larger and more accusatory. Each passing hour brought her closer to the moment when Mr. Devlin would arrive with legal papers and locksmith tools, ready to change her life forever. The pallet that was supposed to save her family had become a monument to her poor judgment. A physical reminder that sometimes taking action is worse than remaining paralyzed by impossible circumstances. Marissa found herself checking her phone obsessively, refreshing her eBay listings every few minutes, hoping for sales that seemed less likely with each passing hour. The shipping cost calculations haunted her dreams, and she began to understand why so many liquidation sellers eventually gave up, their garages and storage units filling with inventory they could never move at prices that would make the effort worthwhile. 26 hours remained on the clock when Marissa decided to give up. The last box from the pallet sat unopened in the corner of her living room, a final insult she didn't have the emotional energy to unwrap. Her eBay listings had generated exactly $43 in sales over 4 days, barely enough to cover the platform fees, let alone make a dent in her rent debt. The mathematics of failure had been calculated and recalculated until the numbers burned themselves into her consciousness like a brand of inadequacy. She sat on her couch with Tyler curled against her side, reading him a story about brave knights and impossible quests, while Emma practiced piano in the next room. The normalcy of the moment felt surreal against the backdrop of their impending homelessness. How do you explain to children that their mother's last desperate gamble had failed? That sometimes courage and determination aren't enough to overcome the brutal arithmetic of poverty? Tyler's breathing had been labored all day, his asthma triggered by the stress he couldn't understand, but somehow absorbed from the atmosphere of desperation that had settled over their home like fog. His inhaler sat on the coffee table next to the unopened box, two objects that seemed to mock her powerlessness in different ways. One represented her failure to provide basic health care without financial strain. The other represented her failure to find a solution to problems that seemed designed to be unsolvable. The box itself looked different from the others, heavier and more carefully packed. Where the other containers had been hastily thrown together with items that clearly didn't belong with each other, this one showed signs of deliberate organization. The tape was applied with precision, the corners reinforced, the weight distribution suggesting something valuable enough to deserve special handling. But Marissa had learned not to trust appearances, not to let hope override hard-earned skepticism about liquidation mysteries. Still, curiosity eventually overcame despair. As Tyler drifted off to sleep against her shoulder, Marissa found herself staring at the unopened box with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for car accidents and natural disasters. She had already lost everything that mattered. What was one more disappointment in the grand catalog of her failures? The box cutter sliced through tape that came away cleanly, revealing packing material that looked professional rather than haphazard. Bubble wrap carefully secured around individual items, foam inserts that suggested fragility and value, the kind of protective packaging that electronics stores used for their most expensive merchandise. Marissa's pulse quickened despite her determination to remain pessimistic, hope beginning to stir like embers in cold ashes. The first item she pulled out was a vintage camera, its metal body heavy and substantial in her hands. The brand name was familiar, but not immediately identifiable, the model number worn but still visible. It looked old but well-maintained, the kind of equipment that photographers either treasured or abandoned depending on their understanding of its significance. The leather case showed wear patterns that suggested regular use rather than neglect, and all the mechanical elements moved with the smooth precision that spoke of quality engineering. Beneath the camera lay a watch, its gold-toned case catching the light in a way that made Marissa's breath catch in her throat. The face was clean and elegant, unmarked by the scratches and dings that usually characterized liquidation jewelry. The band showed signs of wear, but the kind of patina that comes from careful use rather than abuse. Most importantly, the back of the case bore engravings that suggested it might be something more than costume jewelry masquerading as luxury goods. Marissa's hands trembled as she examined the watch more closely. The mechanism visible through the crystal back moved with hypnotic precision, each component working in harmony with the others. She had seen enough pawnshop visits and estate sale browsing to recognize the difference between mass-produced accessories and pieces that might have legitimate value. This watch fell into the latter category, though determining its actual worth would require expertise she didn't possess. Her phone became a research tool as she searched for information about both items, typing brand names and model numbers into search engines with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for medical emergencies. The camera appeared in several collector forums, described as a sought-after model from a legendary manufacturer. The watch proved more elusive, its markings suggesting European origins and possible vintage significance that would require professional authentication to confirm. That's when Marissa discovered the WorthPoint app, a platform that promised to help identify valuable items through photo recognition and expert databases. The interface was clean and intuitive, designed for people exactly like her who found themselves holding mysterious objects that might be worthless or might be worth more than they ever imagined. She created an account with shaking fingers, knowing that this digital tool might be the bridge between her current desperation and a future that didn't end with her children sleeping in her car. The app's camera function analyzed her photos with artificial intelligence that seemed almost magical, cross-referencing her items against millions of sold listings and auction results. The camera received a preliminary valuation that made her heart race, while the watch generated results that seemed too good to be true. But the app was careful to note that these were estimates based on similar items, not guarantees of value, and that professional authentication would be required for any high-value determination. Still, for the first time in weeks, Marissa felt something other than despair. The numbers on her phone screen suggested possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. Outcomes that could not only save her apartment, but potentially provide the financial stability that had always seemed just beyond her reach. The WorthPoint app had transformed two mysterious objects into potential solutions, though she understood that potential and reality were separated by a chasm of verification, authentication, and market timing that might prove impossible to cross in the 25 hours she had left. 18 hours. That's all the time Marissa had left when she realized that finding potentially valuable items was only the beginning of a much more complicated race against the clock. The WorthPoint app had provided tantalizing estimates, but estimates wouldn't convince her landlord to accept partial payment, and they certainly wouldn't transform into actual cash in her bank account before Mr. Devlin arrived with his eviction papers and locksmith tools. She spent the early morning hours diving deeper into the app's authentication features, uploading detailed photos from every angle, and comparing her items against the extensive database of sold listings. The vintage camera appeared to be a 1960s German model that had achieved cult status among collectors, with recent sales ranging from $800 to $1,500 depending on condition and completeness. The watch proved even more intriguing, its Swiss movement and gold case suggesting it might be worth significantly more than she had dared to hope. But the WorthPoint app, for all its sophisticated analysis, could only provide educated guesses based on visual similarities. Real authentication required physical examination by experts who could verify mechanical function, assess wear patterns, and confirm the authenticity of materials and craftsmanship. The app helpfully provided a list of certified appraisers and authentication services, but most required appointments scheduled weeks in advance, shipping items for evaluation, or fees that would eat into any potential profits. Marissa's phone became an extension of her desperation as she called every pawn shop, antique dealer, and camera store within a 50-mile radius. Most were closed at 7 a.m., but she left voicemails with the kind of urgency usually reserved for medical emergencies. The few businesses that answered their phones listened politely to her story, but offered appointments later in the week. Times that might as well have been next year given her impossible deadline. The first breakthrough came from Tony's Camera Repair, a small shop downtown that specialized in vintage equipment. The owner, a man who introduced himself as simply Tony, agreed to look at the camera if she could bring it by before noon. His voice carried the kind of cautious interest that suggested he understood the difference between hopeful amateurs and genuine discoveries, but he was willing to spend 15 minutes examining her find. The watch proved more challenging. Jewelry authentication required specialized knowledge and equipment that most pawn shops didn't possess. Marissa found herself explaining her situation to skeptical voices who had heard similar stories from desperate people trying to turn costume jewelry into rent money. But eventually, she connected with Tito Alvarez, who ran a small shop that dealt in estate jewelry and vintage accessories. Tito's voice carried the weight of experience when he agreed to meet her at his shop at 2 p.m. He explained that proper authentication might take hours, involving tests for gold content, examination of the movement, and research into the manufacturer's records. Even if the watch proved authentic and valuable, converting it to cash would require finding a buyer willing to pay fair market value, a process that normally took days or weeks rather than hours. The morning became a blur of frantic preparation and growing anxiety. Marissa used the WorthPoint app to document every detail of both items, creating a portfolio of photographs and research notes that would support her claims about their potential value. The app's comparison tools helped her identify similar items that had sold recently, giving her ammunition for negotiations with potential buyers or pawn shops. But even as she prepared for authentication meetings, Marissa faced another obstacle that threatened to derail her entire plan. Her PayPal account, which she had relied on for her small eBay sales, suddenly displayed a message that made her blood run cold. Account access limited pending review. The platform had flagged her account for suspicious activity, probably triggered by the sudden increase in listing activity and the unusual pattern of items she was trying to sell. The PayPal freeze meant that even if she managed to sell items online, she wouldn't be able to access the funds for days or possibly weeks while the company conducted their review. Customer service representatives spoke in scripted responses about security measures and verification processes that were designed to protect against fraud but felt like deliberate sabotage when applied to her legitimate emergency. Marissa found herself trapped between the digital platforms that promised easy commerce and the bureaucratic systems that made quick transactions nearly impossible. Every protection designed to prevent scams also prevented desperate people from accessing their own money when they needed it most. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very tools she needed to save her home were now working against her with the efficiency of a perfectly designed trap. The drive to Tony's camera repair felt like heading to a job interview where the position was survival itself. She clutched the vintage camera in its worn leather case, having spent an hour cleaning and polishing every surface until it gleamed with the kind of dignity that valuable objects seem to possess. The WorthPoint app had given her confidence in her assessment, but confidence and cash were very different currencies in the economy of emergency. Tony turned out to be exactly what she had hoped for. A man who understood cameras the way musicians understand instruments, with a passion that transcended mere commerce. He examined her camera with practiced hands, checking the shutter speeds, testing the light meter, and examining the lens for scratches or fungus that would affect its value. His expressions remained carefully neutral, but Marissa could see the interest in his eyes as he discovered that the camera was in better condition than its exterior suggested. The authentication process became a master class in the intersection of craftsmanship and commerce. Tony explained how certain manufacturing details indicated authenticity, how wear patterns suggested the camera had been used by someone who understood its value, and how the completeness of the original accessories significantly impacted market value. The WorthPoint app had been accurate in its assessment, but Tony's expertise revealed nuances that no algorithm could capture. As the clock ticked toward her afternoon appointment with Tito, Marissa realized that authentication was only the first step in a complex dance of verification, negotiation, and conversion that would test every skill she had developed during months of financial desperation. The race against time had become a race against systems designed to work slowly and carefully, luxuries she couldn't afford when measured against the 18 hours remaining until her world changed forever. The clock on Tito's shop wall read 4:17 p.m. when he finally looked up from the vintage watch, with the kind of expression that carries both good news and complications. His jeweler's loupe had revealed what Marissa had desperately hoped to find: authentic Swiss movement, genuine gold case, and manufacturing details that confirmed the piece was worth significantly more than she had paid for the entire pallet. But his next words carried the weight of reality that would define the next chapter of her story. "It's real," Tito said, setting the watch down with the careful respect reserved for valuable things. "1950s Omega, probably worth $1,200 to $1,500 at auction. But here's the problem. I can give you $600 cash right now, or you can try to get full value through a collector who might take weeks to find and longer to pay." $600. The number hung in the air between them like a mathematical equation that solved some problems while creating others. It was enough to prevent immediate eviction, enough to buy her family another month in their apartment, enough to keep Mr. Devlin from changing the locks in the morning. But it wasn't enough to solve the underlying crisis that had brought her to this moment. Wasn't enough to fix the broken systems that made a single mother's survival dependent on luck and liquidation pallets. Marissa's hands trembled as she calculated and recalculated the brutal arithmetic of her situation. $600 would cover most of her back rent, but the late fees and additional charges would still leave her short. The camera that Tony had authenticated as valuable would bring another $300, but only if she could find a buyer quickly. Even combined, her windfall would buy her time rather than security, a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent solution. The decision to accept Tito's offer came with the kind of clarity that desperation provides. She couldn't afford to gamble on finding a collector who would pay full market value, couldn't risk waiting for auction houses or specialty dealers when her children's stability hung in the balance. $600 in cash was $600 more than she'd had that morning, and sometimes the difference between something and nothing is everything. The transaction took less than 10 minutes, but those minutes felt suspended in time as Marissa watched her desperate gamble transform into actual currency. Tito counted out $20 bills with practiced efficiency, each one representing a small victory against the forces that had been closing in around her family. The money felt substantial in her hands, heavier than she had expected, as if the weight of her relief had somehow transferred to the physical bills. But even as she folded the cash into her wallet, Marissa couldn't escape the bitter mathematics of her situation. The vintage watch that had saved her month was now gone forever, along with any chance of receiving its full value. The camera would follow the same path, sold quickly to Tony for less than its worth, because time was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her salvation had come at the cost of accepting less than she deserved, a compromise that felt both necessary and unfair. The drive home from Tito's shop carried the strange mixture of emotions that defines most adult victories: relief that the immediate crisis had been averted, sadness for the opportunities lost in the process of surviving, and anxiety about the underlying problems that remained unsolved. The eviction notice would be satisfied, but the jobs that didn't pay enough, the healthcare system that charged more than she could afford, and the economic structures that made her desperation possible would all still be waiting for her tomorrow. Emma and Tyler were playing in the living room when Marissa walked through the door, their laughter a reminder of what she had been fighting to preserve. They looked up as she entered, their faces bright with the kind of innocence that couldn't fully comprehend how close they had come to losing their home. For them, today had been just another day of school and homework and afternoon cartoons, blissfully unaware of the adult dramas that had played out in pawn shops and camera stores across the city. Marissa called Mr. Devlin from her kitchen, the cash spread across the counter like a small monument to her resourcefulness and compromise. His voice carried surprise when she explained that she could make a substantial payment toward her back rent, enough to prevent the eviction proceedings that had seemed inevitable just hours earlier. The conversation was brief and businesslike, stripped of the drama that had characterized her desperate morning phone calls. But as she arranged to meet her landlord the next morning, Marissa realized that her victory was incomplete in ways that extended beyond the remaining balance on her rent debt. The liquidation pallet that had seemed like such a disaster had ultimately contained exactly what she needed, but only after she had learned to recognize value in forms she hadn't expected and to accept transactions that fell short of ideal but exceeded desperate. The evening brought a different kind of quiet to the apartment. The settled calm that comes after crisis has been navigated rather than solved. Emma practiced piano with the unconscious confidence of a child whose world remained stable, while Tyler read his dinosaur books in the corner that would remain his corner for at least another month. The normalcy felt precious in a way that Marissa knew she would remember long after the immediate fear had faded. As she tucked her children into beds that would remain their beds, Marissa understood that her story was both a success and a cautionary tale. A reminder that sometimes winning means accepting less than you deserve because the alternative is losing everything that matters. The vintage watch was gone, but her family was still home, and in the complex mathematics of survival, that equation balanced perfectly. Marissa stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, not really washing, just letting the warmth settle into her skin. The apartment was quiet in that soft, golden hour kind of way. Outside, traffic murmured and leaves fluttered in late spring wind, but inside, peace, or something like it. She hadn't fixed everything, not even close. The rent was paid, yes. Mr. Devlin had agreed to cancel the lockout, but the debt still loomed, the job still paid too little, and her PayPal account was still under review. The only real difference between today and yesterday was time. 30 borrowed days, a breathing space, a pause, but it was enough. She watched Emma at the piano again, her small fingers pressing keys with the kind of confidence that doesn't ask whether it's earned. Tyler was curled up on the rug, flipping through his favorite dinosaur book, tracing the outline of a T-Rex with the same wonder he'd had for months. They had no idea how close everything had come to falling apart. And maybe that was the point. Maybe Marissa didn't need them to know. Maybe the whole reason she fought so hard was so they never would. The vintage watch and the old camera were gone now, traded for cash, not stories. But somehow, she didn't feel the regret she thought she would. Those objects had value, yes, but not like this. Not like warm food on the table or an uninterrupted bedtime or waking up tomorrow still in the same home you fell asleep in. Survival didn't look like triumph. It didn't come with applause or clarity or a ribbon at the finish line. Most days, it looked like laundry folded late at night or a voice held steady on the phone with a landlord. It looked like compromise. And sometimes it looked like a woman choosing to sell something beautiful, so her children could keep something sacred. Marissa had gambled everything on a pallet of unknowns, and lost, then won, then lost again. She had moved through optimism, failure, despair, and resolve like tides pulling her back and forth. And in the end, it hadn't been the mystery box that saved her. It had been her own relentlessness, her refusal to stop trying, even when trying meant settling for less than fair, less than ideal, but just enough. She dried her hands, turned off the faucet, and looked around the apartment. 2 bedrooms, worn floors, and still hers. Sometimes, in the stories people tell, hope comes in shining packages or windfall checks or fairy tale phone calls. But the real kind of hope? It comes in small, stubborn moments. A knock on the right door. A person who says yes. A Tuesday that ends better than it started. And tonight, Marissa didn't feel like she'd been saved. She felt like she'd endured. And for now, that was everything.